Whoa, my face is super zoomed in here. All right, welcome to the Witching Hour. I am your host, Mike Gilbert. This is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of the unknown. And tonight we dive into one of the most legendary unsolved crimes in American history. Or is it now solved? And I think you can tell by the title what I believe. And we'll get into all the new evidence, all the things that have happened lately, and background on the story. But before we dive into the case, this is going to be the last episode of the Witching Hour for a while. This is always something that I've wanted to do, and I know it doesn't exactly jive with a pro wrestling podcasting network, but I'm still going to do it. I just have to take a little bit of time off because I'm finishing my master's. I just started my final two classes. I started them over the weekend, and I was able to get my classes done a little bit early this weekend, and so I had some time here on a Monday night at 10 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. And I didn't think I was actually going to get to do this because the last couple of nights when I've wanted to, I have been interrupted by a baby. So I had to do dad duty, and to where I'm like, my wife and I, we will kind of divide and conquer where one's taking care of the 6-year-old and the other's taking care of the baby. So we've been kind of having to kind of both chip in. And then, so the last couple of nights, one or the other or both have been keeping us up a little bit late. And so I've just not been able to get to this. But I do appreciate everybody that's supported the show so far. And then once I'm done with my classes, I'll get back to it. Now, I could just pop back up in here in a couple of weeks and knock out something. If a topic comes up that's pretty interesting. As always, if you guys have a topic you want me to cover, feel free to drop me a DM, and I can just give me the information that I need. Give me where I could start the research, and I can kind of get all the notes together, and I can kind of get a script together. That way I can do some of these things. I really liked the last one that we did, the Beast of Glacier National Park. It's a story that I've always kind of wanted to put out there. I have not seen any podcasts out there covering that story, and it would just happened on a whim. I just happened to be watching old episodes of the X-Files, and they brought it up there. So I did a little bit of research and was able to tell that story of Richard Watkins, the Beast of Glacier National Park, and J. Edgar Hoover's connection to the story. And so I thought that was pretty cool. But this week, we're going to talk about D.B. Cooper. I have been fascinated by the D.B. Cooper story for most of my life. I have not done like a ton of research. I'm not like a fanatic, but anytime like a new story comes out about it or a new documentary comes out about it, I always check it out. And but I have not been up to like any of the D.B. Cooper like festivals that they have going on up in like Washington and Oregon and stuff like that. I've not done any of that. But there's always something new coming out every couple of years about DB Cooper. But it has been a while, and just last week we got some new evidence that has been brought to the case. It looks like FBI has reopened the case, which in 2017 it was the case. They kind of just closed it without ever like saying, "Look, we're just not going to investigate this anymore," because we just don't think that we'll ever get to the bottom of it. Well, some citizen journalists and some sleuths out there have put together some information along with some siblings of a son and daughter duo of a man that is now believed to be D.B. Cooper. Now, there's still some skepticism out there, and we'll get to that. But I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to tell the story. And then afterwards, I'm going to give you all my thoughts. And then, of course, I'll interrupt the story now and then to kind of give some comments. But yeah, it's a story of a skyjacking, a daring parachute escape, and a shadowy figure who vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of questions that remain unanswered for more than 50 years later. This is the story of D.B. Cooper, the man who pulled off the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. history. And tonight, we'll explore not just the crime, but also new evidence that could finally crack the case wide open. So settle in, turn the lights low, and join me as we journey into the sky for one of the greatest mysteries of all time. So let me take you back to November 24th, 1971, a quiet Thanksgiving Eve. The world was still reeling from the chaos of the 1960s. political turmoil, the Vietnam War, and a country grappling with change. Now, Vietnam War, I'll pause the story for a sec. Vietnam War, I think that's a very important aspect to this story. And I'll get to why in a little bit. But Vietnam very much has a lot to do with this story. But on this day, something extraordinary was about to happen. At Portland International Airport, a man in his mid 40s approached the ticket counter for Northwest Orient Airlines. He was wearing a business suit, a tie, and a trench coat. He carried a briefcase and identified himself as Dan Cooper. Remember that name, Dan Cooper. This is actually a Dan Cooper story, not DB Cooper. So he never actually called himself Dan Cooper, or he never actually called himself DB Cooper. That was just poor aggregation by the media. He paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle, just $20. It was a routine commuter flight, Flight 305, with 36 passengers on board. No one gave the man a second glance as he calmly boarded the plane. Once in the air, Cooper flagged down a flight attendant and handed her a note. At first, she thought it was just another businessman trying to flirt. She slipped it into her pocket without reading it, but Cooper leaned closer and he said, "Miss, you better read that note. I have a bomb." That's pretty heavy right there. Could you imagine, in 1971, like in 1971, skyjackings are not a thing. Like before that, we had bank robberies, we had train robberies, but like planes, I don't want to say that they're completely new, but commercial airliners flying around all over the place, not that new, or not. I mean, not that old. Like relatively new at this point. And so the stewardess is getting skyjacked, and we hadn't had a lot of these up until that point. Imagine her terror as she unfolded the note and saw the chilling words demanding $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle. He opened his briefcase just enough to show her a tangle of wires and red sticks. Now, whether it was real or not didn't matter. It looked real enough. Now, how is a stewardess supposed to know if this thing is real, right? Like it looks like a bomb. She might as well treat it like it's a bomb. The crew notified the captain, who contacted air traffic control. The FBI was alerted, and a tense negotiation began, all while the plane continued its flight to Seattle. In Seattle, authorities complied with Cooper's demands. They handed over $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Cooper allowed the passengers to leave, but kept the crew on board. Then something extraordinary happened. He ordered the plane to take off again and headed towards Mexico City, flying at an altitude of 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down. An unusual request. Somewhere over the dense forest of the Pacific Northwest, Cooper opened the rear staircase of the Boeing 727. Now, at this point, in 1971, he had to have chosen a very unique plane, because not all the aircrafts at the time had a rear staircase that would actually go down. Most of them didn't. So he either got very lucky or he was very strategic with this. But given who is being accused of being, or who allegedly is Dan or DB Cooper, Dan Cooper, whatever you want to say now, it actually kind of makes sense. The crew remained in the cockpit as instructed, but they felt the sudden change in pressure. Cooper had jumped into the freezing night, carrying the ransom money and wearing one of the parachutes. So he jumps. So to set the scene here, he's at 10,000 feet elevation, right? On Thanksgiving Eve in the Pacific Northwest, in the middle of the night. It's probably either 0-degree weather or below 0-degree weather. And he's jumping out with a parachute and he's got no gloves on, which is pretty insane. I personally have never been like not hijack. I've never been parachuting before. I've never jumped out of an aircraft. I happen to be one of the few Air Force guys in the entire world that's like afraid of flying. What an idiot. But yeah. Somewhere over the dense forest of the Pacific Northwest, Cooper opened the rear staircase of the 727. The crew remained in the cockpit as instructed, but they felt a sudden change in pressure. Cooper had jumped into the freezing night, carrying the ransom money and wearing one of the parachutes. And just like that, he was gone. So wild. Nothing like that had ever happened before. So what happened next baffled investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths for over 50 years. The FBI launched one of the most exhaustive manhunts in its history. They scoured the rugged terrain below the plane's flight path, but found no sign of Cooper or the money, except for $5,800 in decomposed $20 bills discovered along the Columbia River in 1980. Was Cooper a skilled skydiver who planned his escape meticulously, or a reckless gambler who perished in the wilderness? Could he have survived the freezing temperatures and 200-mile winds during the jump? The FBI vetted over 800 suspects, ruling out most, but leaving behind a few tantalizing leads. Some believe Cooper didn't survive the jump, while others were convinced he had orchestrated a perfect getaway. The case inspired books, movies, and a cult-like following of amateur detectives. For decades, D.B. Cooper became an almost mythical figure, a symbol of rebellion and audacity. But despite the countless theories, the FBI closed the case in 2016. I think it was actually 2017, stating that it would no longer actively investigate the matter unless new evidence surfaced. And now, in 2024, new evidence has emerged. Evidence that might finally unmask the man behind the legend. So let's talk about Richard McCoy Jr., a name that's long lingered in D.B. Cooper lore. McCoy was a Vietnam War veteran, a Green Beret, and a skilled helicopter pilot. So this guy, McCoy, is a bona fide war hero. Most stories out there kind of undersell just how amazing this guy was, right? And I'm not talking about the criminal Richard McCoy. I'm just talking about the war hero, right? A guy that was, he was a special forces guy in the 60s when he joined the Army. And he was an enlisted guy. And he did some tours of Vietnam, very decorated, won a ton of awards, highly decorated. And then he ends up getting out of the military. And then he goes back to school and gets his pilot license and becomes a skilled helicopter pilot. And after he gets his license, he could do helicopters and he could do fixed wing aircraft. And he ends up going back into the military. He joined as a warrant officer and rejoins the Army and goes back to Vietnam, which that in and of itself is incredible. Because I've known a lot of people that have gone from like enlisted to officer, but he actually had several years in between his military service where he went back to school, got all his licenses, got his certifications, got his degree, and then commissions as a warrant officer. So a warrant officer, for those who don't know, is kind of like a hybrid between an officer and an enlisted person. In fact, the Air Force didn't have those for a long time. We just got those back, but they have them in the Army and in the Navy. I'm not really too sure about the Marine Corps. I'd have to look into that. I don't really know much about that, but in the Army and the Navy, it's a pretty prevalent thing. It is a very respected thing, but it's like you're kind of like a hybrid in between officer and enlisted, where you get some respect, but you don't get a ton of respect. But in order to be a helicopter pilot, you have to at least be a warrant officer, right? And so he came back in as a warrant officer, and he got the Distinguished Flying Cross, flew tons of tours over there, putting himself in danger, taking out enemy combatants. Now, we can agree or disagree about the reasons why we're in Vietnam. That's not what this show's about. I'm on the side that we probably didn't have any business going over there, and that's probably why Kennedy got killed, to be honest with you, because he was against it too. But so he went back in when he didn't have to, all for love of country and because and a commitment to service and a commitment to duty. This guy goes back to Vietnam and does some heroic shit out there, like super heroic shit. He actually has a Bronze Star, but nobody knows why. And some are speculating that he essentially would have gotten that, but nobody can know why, because he was on some type of top secret mission, which that stuff does happen. So Richard McCoy Jr., big time, like military legend, for real, military legend in Vietnam. Well, he gets out of the military, and in April 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy pulled off almost an identical crime. Using a fake mustache, mirrored sunglasses, and a hand grenade, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight, demanding $500,000 and 4 parachutes, and then he jumped from the plane over Provo, Utah, but was caught within 72 hours. Now, this is where things get interesting. McCoy's children, Shantae and Rick McCoy, believe their father was DB Cooper, and they've come forward with new evidence that might prove it. So let's go back to the Utah skyjacking. Um, actually, let's go back to the DB Cooper one. Let's start there. He After he does the Utah skyjacking, he is essentially like the number one suspect for the DB Cooper skyjacking. But they basically ruled him out for lack of evidence, and because the flight crew could not pick him out of a lineup. So he gets arrested, and then they put him in front of a lineup for the flight crew, and they didn't pick him, right? And so they essentially they kept him for the Utah skyjacking, but they dismissed him from the DB Cooper skyjacking because they essentially just felt like he was a copycat, right? Um, and all these years later, for this new evidence to come out, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, it kind of, if I'm the FBI, I'm pretty like pretty like embarrassed by this, because they had him at the time and they've just been investigating him forever, and they didn't close the case because the flight crew couldn't pick him out of a lineup when he was very likely wearing some type of disguise, right? He wasn't wearing a fake mustache in the DB Cooper thing, but he was wearing some type of disguise. The funny enough, the same thing happened with the Utah skyjacking. They weren't able to pick him out of a lineup there. The flight crew couldn't pick him out because he was wearing a fake mustache. So like they just couldn't finger him as the guy, right? So he has not been, like, there are no actual witness statements that ever have been able to pick him to say that he actually did this, right? But the Utah skyjacking, he told his sister, who was happened to be dating a local deputy sheriff, and then the deputy sheriff turned him in essentially to the FBI, and then he gets arrested, and while he's in custody, he ends up escaping custody in this town in Utah. He ends up escaping custody, and he's like running down the street in an orange jumpsuit, and they catch the guy again, Richard McCoy. I think the FBI would want me to hate this guy, but I just think he's more badass. Like, each time I listen to these stories and I tell the story, so he gets arrested again, okay, and then he goes into I believe, I might have to look it up. I'm pretty sure it's Lewiston Prison. Okay, I'm gonna look up Richard McCoy Jr. But I'm pretty sure it was Lewiston Prison where he ends up going to prison. I believe that's a federal penitentiary, and while he's there, he ends up escaping again. So he's there for like a couple of years, and he has a couple of accomplices, and he would actually go jogging every day around the track. And while he's jogging, like, the garbage man would come by, and like there was a gate nearby, and they would let the garbage man in. And so he's jogging one day, and he had this whole thing planned out. He actually, like, one of the other prisoners who was a volunteer at the dental clinic actually gave him some plaster, and then he turned that plaster into like a not a real gun, but like he shaped the plaster in the shape of a gun and then painted it black. So when the garbage man came in, he actually hijacked the garbage man with two other guys. And then they end up making their escape, and then he escapes. So a second time he escapes custody, and he's essentially on the run for like 6 months. At one point, they go to his family farm in North Carolina, and the FBI is there, and they're pissed, right? And because while he's out on the run, he's with this other guy. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I should have had the name written down, so my bad. But he's with another guy that he was in prison with, and who is like a pretty famous bank robber. So they're like robbing banks like this whole time to make ends meet. And meanwhile, this guy is like, he's got a wife and he's got 2 kids and he's a Mormon. It's like it's a pretty wild story. Like, this dude's such a legend, man. And he never kills anybody. He just like threatens people, but at no point does he ever kill anybody during this run. But he Anyway, he gets caught like 6 months later because apparently, so the story goes, the guy that he was robbing banks with, essentially turned him in. So that guy had gotten caught, and then he led him to Richard McCoy Jr. And Richard McCoy Jr. has got some groceries. They're in Alabama at this point. He's got some groceries in his arms, and he's walking up to the door. The door opens, and it's FBI, and they just kill the guy on the spot. And they told everybody that they were gonna kill him on sight when they saw him, and then they essentially murdered him. And the wife, his spouse name is Karen McCoy, filed a wrongful death lawsuit, but that just ended up tied up in paperwork, so they never did anything with that. But yeah, so this guy Richard McCoy Jr., if he just kind of sounds like a guy that would be capable of pulling off the DB Cooper heist over the Pacific Northwest. The guy has tons of experience jumping, tons of flight experience. He was a fixed wing pilot and a helicopter pilot, and he had been doing jumps. Like when he was an enlisted man, he had been done tons of jumps over in Vietnam, where you're landing in a jungle, right? And you have to know land nav, you have to know all that stuff, and you have to know all the ins and outs of being able to jump and to survive those types of jumps. So, like, as far as somebody qualified to pull this thing off, Richard McCoy Jr., like, checks every box. And I have to reiterate, the only reason why he wasn't chosen or he wasn't arrested as DB Cooper after the Utah skyjacking was because of insufficient evidence, which is just wild to me. So in 2022, aviation YouTuber Dan Greider discovered a modified parachute in an outbuilding on the McCoy family property in North Carolina. This parachute matched the unique modifications described by veteran skydiver Earl Cossey, who had provided the parachutes used in the Cooper hijacking. So whenever he landed in Seattle from the Portland flight, he landed in Seattle and needed the parachutes. This guy, Earl Cossey, who is like a parachute expert, provided them. And so he used one of Earl Cossey's parachutes. And Earl Cossey did specific modifications that only he would know about. And of those are his type. Now they might be more, like, popular now, but back then, like, he was the only one doing those. And I don't really know the specific details, to be honest with you. I watched something and they talked about it, but I don't really understand it because like I said, I've never worn a parachute. But so they found this on the family property. So it would have been McCoy's mother, who had passed away during COVID. His son and his daughter allowed this YouTuber to come in and take a look at it. And he took a look at the parachute. And sure enough, it's the same type that Earl Cossey would make. And the same type that Earl Cossey would have given to the FBI to give to Cooper to be able to use. Now, the problem is, and here's where it gets a little bit wonky. The problem is that they didn't really take down the serial numbers back in those days. Whenever they handed them the parachutes, they had the serial numbers for the money. That's where they were able to find the money on the riverbank 10 years later. But they never took down the serial number of the parachute, and no parachute was ever recovered. So by all accounts, this could be the parachute. I'm not going to say definitively, but this absolutely could be. And Greider and the McCoys handed the parachute over to the FBI last fall. The agency has since conducted a thorough search of the property and even requested DNA samples from the McCoy family. Greider believes this parachute is the smoking gun, evidence that could finally prove that Richard McCoy was DB Cooper. I think he is DB Cooper. I think this case is solved. And so we're waiting for the evidence to come back. So FBI has like the tie, like DB Cooper for whatever reason left the tie there, but so many people handled that tie without wearing gloves that they were not ever able to get like a full fingerprint of it because the chain of custody and the crime scene preservation was just not good, which is pretty funny because I have a very basic knowledge of crime scene preservation. I've been through the training with the FBI twice, and a very basic level training, and even I would know not to touch that fucking thing. But in 1971, they didn't really think about that stuff a lot. And the FBI was wholly incompetent back then. They were more of a criminal organization. Some people think that they are now. I think they're more a little bit more buttoned up, but they can't be weaponized for different things. But back then, they were just doing the bidding of J. Edgar Hoover, which is why when they found that guy in Alabama, McCoy, after he had evaded them so many times and escaped their custody so many times, they were super embarrassed. They just showed up and killed the guy. The FBI's renewed interest in this case is significant. After years of dormancy, agents have examined the parachute skydiving logbook. So the logbook is another thing. That is another big piece of evidence because um, weeks and months prior to November, I believe 1971, Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, he had done 38 jumps up until that moment, and then he allegedly does the jump Thanksgiving Eve, and then he takes a break, and then 5 months later he has logged another jump. And then right after that is the Utah incident. And then after that, he doesn't have another one in his logbook because he goes to prison. Right. Now, it seems like that he had been training for that jump in Washington, the Oregon, the DB Cooper jump, which is why he had so many jumps leading up to that point. He wasn't just a guy who liked to jump. I mean, I'm sure he was, but this very much reads like this guy was training for a specific jump. And he did it 38 times leading up to that moment, and then did the DB Cooper heist. And then he takes a break for a few more months and realizes, hey, look, I did it before, I can do it again. $500,000 this time. I'll up the ante to $5 and pull it off, but I'll do it in Utah, which is kind of where he was like living at the time. Do it in Utah, and then I have enough money to go back to North Carolina. But unfortunately, he spoke to the wrong person. Who he spoke to his I get it. So the story goes that he was bragging that he could do it and that he would ask for more money, and he just bragged to the wrong people, and one of those people just happened to be a deputy sheriff who turned him in. So that deputy sheriff is very much like a snitch. But it's like, what? He's law enforcement already. So what is he going to do? Like, he has no choice at that point but to turn the guy in. Rick McCoy stated that the FBI is even considering exhuming his father's body to obtain a definitive DNA sample. So Rick McCoy III said that the FBI asked him that, but he is not willing to do that just yet. He did a very good interview on the Bridge podcast, and that doesn't sit right with him. And he doesn't have a whole lot of trust of the FBI because of what they did to his dad. So say he's not DB Cooper, just Rick McCoy Jr., what happened to him very much is a travesty. And I think that case needs to be reopened. And I think they need to be looked at for how they handled it. But the sister wants them to be able to do that. The sister has given the green light, but the brother has, at this point, he has not given the go-ahead. So while the agency remains tight-lipped, the fact that they've taken this step suggests they're taking the Greider's evidence seriously. But not everyone agrees with this theory. Skeptics point to McCoy's age. He was only 27 at the time, while witnesses describe Cooper as being in his mid-40s. Look, back in those days, 27-year-olds looked a lot older, and this brother was very likely wearing a disguise. Of what kind, I don't know, right? And he had been through some shit. He was Special Forces Vietnam and then a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. This guy had lived several lifetimes at the age of 27. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that this dude looked like he was in his mid-40s when he was only 27. Others question whether a devout Mormon like McCoy would drink bourbon and smoke, as Cooper did during the flight. Devout Mormons also do hijackings, but he definitely did one when he hijacked the plane in Utah. And essentially, he was kicked out of the Mormon church. They turned their backs on him when he got arrested for that second one. But a devout Mormon, they don't skyjack, they don't rob banks, they don't escape prison, they don't do any of that stuff. He still practices faith, but leaving Vietnam can do stuff to a man. Leaving war zones can do stuff to a man. He probably was involved with some unspeakable, unimaginable things. Like his son tells a story that when he got out, after the second time when he left Vietnam, when he was the pilot, he went to the VA complaining about migraines and complaining about issues from the war. And the VA looked into it, and he had his pilot's license revoked. They punished him for asking for help. So if you want to know what turns a man, that stuff turns a man. This devout Mormon, this war hero, this legend, American hero, turns to a life of crime after his government turned their backs on him. I could see that. That makes sense to me. Still, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. McCoy had the skills, the knowledge, and the motive to pull off the Cooper hijacking. For Shantae and Rick McCoy, this journey has been deeply personal. They grew up knowing their father as a decorated war hero and a loving parent, but they also lived under the shadow of his crimes. Shantae describes her father as a man who felt betrayed by his country after Vietnam, struggling to support his family and suffering from debilitating migraines. She believes he saw the hijackings as a desperate attempt to save his family from financial ruin. Rick, meanwhile, idolizes his father despite his crimes and sees him as a complex figure, a hero in some ways and a criminal in others. Both siblings are eager for closure. They want the truth to come out so they can finally move on. The story of D.B. Cooper remains one of the most fascinating mysteries of our time. Was Richard McCoy the infamous hijacker, or is the truth still out there, waiting to be uncovered? As new evidence continues to surface, we may finally get the answers we've been searching for. But until then, the legend of D.B. Cooper will live on, tantalizing us with the possibility of the perfect crime. I'm going to go ahead and correct the record. I think this thing is over. Now, there are some D.B. Cooper loyalists and crazies, enthusiasts. There's a lot of people, especially in the Pacific Northwest, that are still making money off the idea that this is a mystery. I think it's McCoy. I think this whole thing's over. I've seen some other documentaries. There was one that was on, I think, History like a decade ago, and they were trying to pin it on a guy named Robert Rackstraw, who was still alive at that point and was living in San Diego. He was another, like a Vietnam vet, had all the qualifications of somebody that could do it. He was the age of somebody that could do it. And it just wasn't him. They had no evidence. And in fact, I think he was actually investigated for that crime several times and it just never came through. So Robert Rackstraw was another, and there were several others. But I think if you just keep going back to this Rick McCoy Jr., he did it in Utah. Like he did it again. And most of these people, like most people don't rob a bank and then they're just done, right? Most people they do it again and again and again until they get caught. It makes sense that McCoy, as D.B. Cooper, Dan Cooper, whatever you want to call him, would successfully pull this heist off. And then it's like, you know what? I was able to do that. Let's do it again. And then he does it a second time and he gets cocky. And then that's when he gets caught. But the guy very clearly had a skill set for this because he pulled off two and he was successful at them. The problem is he just talked to the wrong person on the second one. But this guy's so skilled that he escaped custody twice, to where now, like, they have rules implemented in prisons all over the country. You see the FAA laws that we have all the time. Like, this guy really has changed the world for the better with his crimes, which is a weird thing to say. Like, this criminal has changed, but we're much safer on airplanes because of him. And we're much safer on airplanes after 9/11 too. So I'm going to go ahead and say that he's DB Cooper. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I know this is a bit of a controversial one to say that this whole thing is solved, but I think it's solved. I think we're done here on this one. But thank you for joining me tonight on the Witching Hour. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share your thoughts. Who do you think DB Cooper was? So if you're a DB Cooper enthusiast And it's not Rick McCoy. Is it Robert Rackstraw? Who else is it? Who else could it be? Give me a name. But back your claim up with some articles, some periodicals, some evidence if you got it. Back it up if you want to come on here and tell me your thoughts, and I come back to this podcast, which I will come back to this podcast. It might be a little bit, but it is coming back. This is not the end of the witching hour. More stories are going to happen, and I'm going to cover those stories because I obviously have I have a heart for this stuff. I'm very enthusiastic about these topics. So again, if you have any other ideas of things that you want me to talk about, you want me to cover, or you want to come on the show and tell me your story, let me know. I'd love to do that. It might be a little while until we're next time, but we'll be back right here on the Witching Hour. So until next time, leave the lights on and your mind open. Mahalo. Let's flip.